like you said, this is Documenting RESTful APIs with Spring RESTdocs. I'm Jen Strater, or you may know me on Twitter as the Code Generator. Haha. Thought that was it is a great Twitter handle, isn't it? So the way this is going to work is kind of in two steps. So I'm going to go through a story of how I came to use Spring RESTdocs in the first place, and kind of some things that you need to think about with API documentation, whether you choose to use Spring RESTdocs or a different API documentation solution. And then hopefully, once I've convinced you that Spring RESTdocs is the way to go, I'll dive into kind of what it is, and hopefully, if everything works with the projector, you'll get to see the code and see how it runs. Actually, in a few minutes, a tweet should go out with the link for SpeakerDeck. And if you download download the slides from SpeakerDeck, you should be able to click any of the links that are in these slides, including for the 3 examples that are listed here for brevity. Okay. So that's a little bit about how it's going to work. And of course, one of the advantages of showing up in person is that you can stop me at any point, right, and ask questions. But a little bit about me and why you want to listen, right? So I am actually more of a Groovier person than a Java person, right? I co-founded an organization 5 years ago called Great Ladies, which is supposed to support and encourage more women to join the Groovy ecosystem. Unfortunately, that has been deprecated, and going forward, we'll be in a more inclusive diversity organization with a group that's going to expand just outside of women and into other forms of diversity as well. I've taught all kinds of workshops on Groovy and how to create web applications for both people new to programming and people just new to the ecosystem. As you may be able to tell from my accent, I am an American, and I, after university, spent several years working there before I took a fairly prestigious research grant to go study in Denmark, and got to do a lot of really interesting things at the Technical University of Denmark. I studied the compiler theory behind Groovy and some static analysis things, and got to contribute back to some of this stuff too. Let's see. But now I am actually at a startup in Berlin. So I've moved around a bit. And I'm really glad to be able to travel a lot more now. And so at ZenJob, as it says, I have to do my pitch, right? They helped pay for me to come here. So ZenJob is a fully automated staffing agency. We have, like everyone else, we're hiring. So if you are interested in moving to Berlin, or you know someone in Berlin, you're welcome to send them our way. It's mostly Groovy on the back end, and we also have front end, DevOps, everything. It's on the website, zenjob.de. Okay, so that is enough about me, hopefully enough. I would also like to know a little bit about all of you so that I make sure that we're on the same page. Maybe we go over in a little more detail some things that not everyone knows. So I assume that if you're coming to this talk, you know what a RESTful API is, or at least have a baseline for how to create one. There are 3 very different ways to create RESTful APIs, particularly in Groovy. I'm expecting that the most popular one is going to be Spring Boot. So who has used Spring Boot by show of hands? Almost everyone. And is anyone actually using Spring Boot 2? Okay, decent number, like half. But okay, so I'll explain a little bit about the new 2 stuff. Who uses Grails? Anyone? Anyone know what it is? Okay, so yeah, I don't have that one example in the slides today, so that's okay. Who knows or has used Ratoack? Okay, more than I thought, actually. Like, usually there's like one person, and now there's quite a roomful. But for For everyone who doesn't know what Ratoack is, it's a really awesome micro framework. But the reason why it's really interesting to study for documentation is that it has a unique way of handling, or of route handling, and that makes it very difficult for some tools to parse what endpoints are available. And so I actually have a demo of that. So that's how to create them. And now, what have you used to document them? And these are all up here because they're things I've done. So please don't be embarrassed if you haven't gotten to try something new and cool. Hopefully everyone at least has experience with writing docs out by hand, using either wiki pages or some kind of Word doc. The company I'm at right now, we have a plethora of Confluence pages. Who has at least written some documentation? Okay. Who has gotten the opportunity to use a code-driven solution like AsciiDoc or AsciiDoctor? Okay, come on in. Sorry. Okay, so a handful. Okay, so I'll try to explain what that is a little bit more. And who has used something completely auto-generated like Swagger and or RAML for their document? Okay. And for documentation too, or just for the spec? But a little bit of, okay. So now that you know a little bit about me, I know a little bit about you, I hope that I can share my secret with you. I hate writing documentation. And so I put this in asterisks, right? Because why am I giving a talk on documentation when I don't like writing it myself? And that's actually kind of important. So the thing that I don't like about writing documentation are all of the manual steps. So I don't like writing the same thing over and over again. I don't like every time I have to make a hot fix that I need to then go and remember to update the documentation too. So let's see, it's been a while now. So in 2015, when I was a consultant for this very large enterprise that had lots of divisions and lots of teams, I was tasked with coming up with a centralized system or standards, perhaps, for how to do API documentation across all of our different teams. And so I wasn't very happy about this because I didn't want to have to write those documents myself. So I went to each team and I looked at the different things that each one was using and identified some different tools that maybe people had used or that we could use. And luckily this was at a very important point in time because this was right when Spring REST docs had come out. Okay, so the things that were kind of most important. So hopefully you take home the message that no matter what you choose for your API documentation, you think about and go through the steps of finding the right tool. So the most important thing for us, or one of the things, was to identify what our APIs are actually doing. So do we actually have RESTful APIs? And who's seen this graphic before or is familiar with the Richardson model? Okay, so only about half. So the idea here is that it's a categorization of different things that people do, and then they call it a RESTful API. And I don't want to get into an argument of whether this is right or wrong, but the thing that I like about this model and this categorization is that you can kind of classify where you are and where you want to get to. And so when I looked at all of the different teams that were in our group, I found that we weren't really using that many features. So we didn't have a level 0 where it was completely chaos and we weren't following any conventions. We were usually following the conventions when it comes to naming the resources and sometimes using the right HTTP verbs and statuses, but we weren't using hypermedia in most of the APIs. But it was also important that we didn't limit ourselves to any tools because of where we were in that spectrum. So it's really not RESTful APIs. I should go back and rename it to REST-like APIs, right? Okay. So if you haven't seen this talk, it's great. One of the other things that we noticed, so this is the history of how software evolves, right? That this organization, this big enterprise, had started out as a small company, and they had their monolith that grew and grew and grew, and then as the organization grew, it kind of split out into lots of different teams, lots of different microservices, and so this slide actually comes from a member of the Groovy community, Alvaro Sanchez, and if you look him up on Twitter or Google, you can find the original talk where he goes through how to do this properly. But the important thing with documentation is that if you don't start with a good documentation strategy, when you split it up, it's going to make it even harder. Because now you have all of these different microservices to manage. And so the things that came up and that we were complaining about is that each team was using something different. So there's no consistent look and feel. And each team was kind of working in its own little silo. There's no documentation about how to work through the system as a whole. So how do these different microservices work together? And when you pick a documentation tool, think about some of these things. Okay. And so once you have all of these different services, there are things that you may only need to document once. So some central information, probably about things like security. So if you have a security service, if you're following a standard like OAuth or using JWT tokens, that's not something that you need to repeat on every service. You might be able to get away with just doing it once. If you're using something like Spring Boot, which almost everyone in here had, you get a lot of things like error handling, and it's very uniform, and that's very nice too. So you don't have to keep repeating a lot of the same things. But one of the things that surprised me, perhaps, as an engineer, was that document design was actually an important feature for the higher-ups in this organization. So when we started, some of the teams were using a documentation solution that looks like this. So who has seen, you probably can't tell which API this is from just by looking at it, but this style is very familiar to some of you, right? Okay. For those of you that have not seen this before, in 20 seconds or less, can you tell me what this API does? Okay, there is a pet store. But what can you do with this pet store? So even for engineers, but particularly for people who don't understand how REST APIs work, maybe, this was not very intuitive. And so the CTO kept complaining that he had to search through this giant list of URLs to find out what he really wanted, which was a solution that kind of grouped things by topic. So this example it comes from the Spring Ratoack's sample resource or sample projects, but it's actually an ASCII doc format. And so the major difference here is that it's a very different way of organizing information. You have your table of contents that it kind of groups things by topic rather than by URLs. It can still be, of course, very technical. You've got all your verbs and status codes and information that's relevant, but it might be able to give you a broad overview instead. Okay. So those were some of the things that we thought were important when we looked at what each team was doing. The next thing was to try and find a tool that helps us get on the right track. And so there are lots of different tools that you can use for documentation. And I kind of found 3 different categories of kind of where they came in. So the first one is not actually about documentation at all. It's definitions. So Swagger, and I keep saying Swagger, but it's really now the Open API specification, and RAML are definitions for APIs. And when you combine them with documentation, maybe you already have some ASCII doc markdown or even some wikis, you can get tools that kind of intersect in this space. And the thing that maybe not everyone looks at is the way that testing intersects with documentation as well as the definitions. So if you notice, I kind of put Swagger UI in the middle here because it does a little bit of everything. If you have a Swagger specification, you can get some documentation. You might be able to use a tool for some manual testing. But you can also leverage some of the existing test frameworks that you have, if it's mock MVC, Rest Assured, or now the new Spring Boot 2 test web client. You can also see a different pattern in way that you can track the way that the APIs work. So if we start with a contract first approach, you can assert that what you intended to do matches the definition, but do you actually know if that's what you implemented? And so that's kind of why Spring REST docs came in the middle between testing and documentation, to assert that what you actually did in your implementation matches the rest of your expectations. So before we can actually get to Spring REST docs, we should talk about what the other options were, right? And so, yes, Swagger, the most popular one. So overall, Swagger is a lot of things. It's a document, you can use it for documentation, but at the core, it's a standard for describing what your API is going to do. And it's very popular because there have been lots of plugins built on top of it. So you can make client libraries out of it. You can generate docs. There's lots of things. But of course, I keep saying Swagger because this is what was available at the time, but it's really the specification formerly known as Swagger, and it's now Open API Initiative. That's like the same thing now. Okay. So this is all about an automated approach. And if you haven't seen Swagger before, the most popular one or library to do that for Spring is called Spring Fox. Each little release has a cute little picture of a fox, which is nice. But the reason why it's so popular and why some of the teams that I was working with had used it is because it has a lot of pre-configured defaults. It's really easy to set up. You add 2 dependencies, one for generating a Swagger specification, one for setting up a UI. And in about 10 lines of code, you can, assuming you're on a very simple, basic example, get going with some auto-generated documentation. And of course, there are other ways to do this too, but this was the one that we were using at the time. The other alternative, if, like us, you ended up in a case where it wasn't the perfect solution, is that you can manage your own Swagger specification. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So you get some information about what version of the spec it is, and further down in the file, you'll get all of your different endpoints, and what it takes is input and output and such. But I already talked about how I don't like to write out documentation. I especially don't want to have to maintain a custom Swagger specification and have to remember to update it every time. Okay, but if you do have this, and maybe you've seen it before, and I showed it before, the Swagger UI takes any specification and makes the URI-centric design like this. Okay. So I'd already kind of hinted at some of the things that were troubling about going down that path. And it mostly came down to what was available out of the box and what we had to constantly keep overriding. So we were using a very different form of security, and we had to keep adding the tokens. And so we couldn't use the out-of-the-box Spring Fox UI and had to maintain that ourselves anyway. We also ended up in some interesting situations with object mapping. So yeah, so this was actually an issue that came up because it didn't make any sense to our end users what my custom object is as a return type. what is my custom object? It has these different variables, these different data types, and so on every single, you can reuse some of it, but you have to keep describing these things. So as we started adding more and more overrides, the less benefit we were getting out of an automated solution. The other thing that that came up, and this is outdated, I do have to say this, that at the time that we were doing the evaluation, hypermedia was not something that was supported, and there are tons of open issues that got closed. And pretty much in many of the early Spring Restock talks, you'll find this slide that says that hypermedia was not supported. It is now in the new version of the specification. There is some support for links. There's still issues because it doesn't support every case, but at least it's getting started. But the thing that I disliked the most about this approach, oh, you know what's coming next, don't you? Is what I'm going to call Annotation Hell. So this is actual code that I pulled from one of our projects. I renamed all the variables so that I could put it on a slide, so it's okay. But this is just one example that fit on a slide, right? And so if the thing to notice here is that like half the screen is just annotations related to the documentation. And if you multiply this across every method on every controller, and this was just like in this one team, it makes it a lot harder to read what's actually going on. And the biggest issue that I had is that there's no guarantee that this is actually correct. So there were no tests that asserted that what I wrote here in the annotations, so it just took these annotations. I mean, this happens with like Java docs too, right? That you write what it is, and then 2 months later you change what the parameters are, and suddenly your comments are out of date. That there was no security here, even having all of this right directly in the source code. So if you pull out those annotations, the slide got reformatted a little bit, but it is a lot easier to read if I format it properly. So I've harped on a lot of the problems that we had with Swagger, but there is one major advantage that made it very useful, and that is the try it button. A very nice feature happens, so I should have copied the original thing. So you saw that list of all of the URLs. If you click any one of those lines, it'll expand out into a further description of what each URL does. And you can precede that with some data that QA, for example, can use and hit a button to run it against your local environment or against the server that it's running on. And so our QA teams really liked this because they could press a button, they could manipulate a few things on the input and have an interactive console for doing that. And that is something that's really, really hard to replicate in other tools and other frameworks. But there was also one thing about this that made me as an engineer a lot lazier. So I'd start writing a new endpoint or changing something, and I'd go and I'd hit the button and make sure that it worked. And I wouldn't go back and write any tests. So I was getting very lazy by just saying, oh yeah, I'm doing a manual test and it works. But in the long run, that had repercussions because QA would then test it further and find bugs. But it's not all bad. So there are some alternatives to the Swagger UI button in Spring RESTdocs. So Spring RESTdocs also generates curl statements for you. It's not pretty, but if you're happy with the command line, and a lot of people are, you can take the curl statement, copy paste it into your terminal, and you have, in this case, it's like just a get. But if it's a post, you could have all of the data pre-generated for you, and you'll get the response that you want. The tool that I really like now is Postman. So we're using this at EdZenJob to do some manual testing in a very similar way. And So Postman, who's used Postman or knows what it is? Okay, so I don't have to go into what it is. And so if you go back and watch the video of when I gave this talk in December at Spring 1, I said I was going to fix this, and I haven't. But luckily, someone else did for me. So there is now a NPM package that you can run. It's not the prettiest solution, but it takes the generated snippets from Spring REST docs and creates a Postman collection that you can import and run that way. Okay. Yeah, and there are lots of other solutions that you can also use to kind of mix and match the concepts of Swagger and Spring REST docs. So if you really want to use Markdown, there's a library for that. The other concept is this idea of getting out of sync between your contract and your actual implementation. And so there you can use a Sergey Swagger, or you can also use Spring Cloud contracts. And there's a really, really nice section in the documentation about that can describe it a lot better than I can. But the idea is that when you run all of this together, you get wire mocks and documentation. So in kind of the summary of tooling, so it's important to actually figure out what problem you're trying to solve and make sure that you pick the right tool for that. And if you're kind of at this intersection and you've looked at all of the different things, maybe Spring REST docs is a good solution for you. Okay. And so the thing that Spring REST docs does differently is that it creates test-driven documentation. So what does that mean? If you start with the concept of test-driven development, you start with a failing test, and then you make it go green, and then you refactor, and you have this life cycle. And so test-driven documentation takes that one step further. So you start with a failing test, and you need to write documentation to make it go green. When you refactor your API again, your test will start failing if you don't update your documentation. So it adds into this feedback loop that you should already have if you're doing test-driven development, and make sure that your docs are also up to date. And so I really liked this solution because it solved some of the problems that I've been talking about. That it reduces a lot of duplication in the code, that we're getting the implementation solution. And it also, in the end, made me write more tests, because in order to get the documentation, I have to write the tests, and then I find more bugs, hopefully, before QA does.
But all of those tests were API tests, right? So basically, you have to have the whole application running, and well, those are not usually too fast. So this
Right.
A test suite that you can use in everyday development, because it takes more than 10 seconds.
That is a potential problem. Yeah. 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 I mean, but that depends on your development cycle too. So if you run your tests on every run, then it's going to take a long time anyway, because it's running tests even not related to the things that you're working on, right? You can have that outside. You can run nightly tests. I mean, definitely please run your tests before you push. But yeah, that's a good point. So then we get to Spring REST docs, which is an implementation of the concept of test-driven documentation. And so the things that it does, even beyond just adding documentation to your development cycle, is that it generates the code snippets for you. You can hook it in with your Spring tests, and you can make your build fail as you're going. The other interesting thing that it does is the support for hypermedia, and in cases where you can't do dynamic, you can't do an automatic generated solution like Ratoack, because you can't introspect that. Okay. Yeah. So what is Spring REST docs? Or how do you get started? So you can start by reading the docs. It's a documentation tool. The docs are really good. You can follow new releases on Twitter or any of the issues and file issues on GitHub. It's a pivotal project, so it's got a lot of support. The lead developer is Andy Wilkinson, who's really active. In fact, there are lots of mails in my inbox I haven't had time to read yet. Hopefully he is not released again so that all of these slides are now out of date. But prior to that, the most recent release was in April, and there'll be links to all of that. Okay. So it comes with a lot of things out of the box, including support for 3 major testing frameworks. So originally, when we first started looking at Spring REST docs, it was only mock MVC, which works if you're in a very specific environment using the Spring ecosystem. But if you, well, we weren't at the time, but later came up with an example that uses Grails and Ratoack, you may need a stronger client like Rest Assured. Now that Spring Boot 2 is out, the new web test client is even more powerful. And it kind of uses a combination of these 2 approaches. So who's used mock MVC and knows? Okay. So mock MVC runs it doesn't run the entire application sometimes. You can get away with just running a mock of certain parts of it. So you can run just against one controller. You don't necessarily have to run against the entire security suite or any marshalling, but of course maybe you need to do that. Which is really good if you want to test some small part of it, but sometimes you need the entire application context, or it's not something you have direct control over. But now Web Test Client kind of has both features, and it's really cool, and you should go back and watch some of the talks from Spring 1, because it does amazing things. And of course, my examples are all Groovy and Gradle, but you can use Maven too. I won't judge. Okay. And then it does support two documentation formats out of the box, ASCII doc, and if you have to, Markdown. And there are lots of sample projects. So the Spring Boot one is pretty simple. I contributed the Grails one, and it's updated to something fairly recent, but if you have problems, let me know. And there's more samples being added, not every day, but fairly regularly. So even if you don't see yours on this list, or your setup on this list, it may be there. Okay. So let's actually look at some code and stop listening to me talk. I started with a simple Groovy Spring Boot project, added the ASCII Dr. Gradle plugin, and it's now updated to Web Test Client using Spock, and we can publish these at the end to GitHub pages. Okay. It's not Spark MVC anymore, it's now the Reactor stuff. So now we're going to see if this works. Okay. So everyone, I know it's kind of big and hopefully not too unreadable. Looks okay. Although, well, if you can't see in the back, you can come forward. Right. So it's a basic Spring Boot application, and it has 3 main endpoints. I'm also using the Spring Data REST plugin with MongoDB, which just makes it easier to do this greeting repository. So the greeting repository, I'm not doing anything special. You just have to write the interface and define what you want the repository to mock. So the basic idea is that you have a collection of greetings. Each one has an ID and a message. There's a bit of validation, things that have to do with Mongo's ID structure and that don't submit a message that's blank. Okay, that's the basic idea of what this application does. Of course, I went about this from a slightly different approach because if you're starting with a new application, hopefully you're doing your tests first, right? But if you're like me and you're adding this to existing applications, you may already have some controllers. So the next thing is to add, or you may have some docs that exist already. So ASCII doc is a format, and it looks very, very similar to Markdown. If you've used Markdown with like GitHub or Confluence or some other thing, you get some very simple syntax that designates information about how you want this document to be styled, but a lot of it is about writing the information that you want in each section. And then you can take a tool called ASCII Doctor and take this format and convert it into lots of different things. So you can, yes?
Have you tried using this ASCII Doctor J with UML generation? Or
I haven't. I saw a talk on it about a month ago, but I haven't for this part. Okay. Right. So this is, basic out of the box ASCII doc with generation to ASCII Doctor. Most of it works through Gradle. You have to add in, there's a plugin that helps do that, and you have to set up some basic configuration. If you're using the Spring RESTdocs version, there's actually a separate plugin that you can use that will set some defaults, so you don't even have to set the entire ASCII Doctor configuration up. And the most important thing is to set up where you want your generated code to go, and you probably want to make sure that your tests run first, otherwise you're creating some bad links. And this was mostly a hack to get it to run on local. So if you take and actually run the ASCII doc Gradle command at this point, you would get a document that converts all of this and into the doc you've seen. Documentation, ASCII Doctor. Okay, the party parrot looks very strange in this presentation view. Yeah, it's not partying. It's just kind of moving. Okay, so and actually it was probably cached already because I ran this as a demo ahead of time. So in your build directory, you'll get an HTML file, which if you open it in the browser, becomes this guide. And so you get some tables, some information, things like this, and we can eventually get our snippets in here. Let's see. Gradle test. Okay. So then you probably want to see how you actually get the snippets to generate. And so that's in the tests. There are Groovy tests, of course. And for good practice, I created a central controller that kind of shares between the different tests. Who's familiar with Spock? Almost everyone. Right. Very similar to JUnit. It's groovy. It does a lot of things to shortcut having to write it all out. The important part with Spring RESTdocs here is that it's actually, so Spock uses JUnit as a test runner if you have it set up that way. And so we can use the JUnit REST documentation that's set up and hook that into even if it's a Spock test. So web test client is started here. We're binding it so that we know where to go. For simplicity, I added greetings as the shortcut because we're only testing the one controller. This is how the Spring RESTdocs stuff actually works. So it filters into each request and it reads the request and the response that's generated during your test run. And you can also pre-process or post-process information. The one that I tend to use the most is the pretty print operation. It just takes the JSON that's both in the request and the response and formats it a little nicer than just one giant long string. But you can also do a different processing if, for example, you are running your tests locally or on a build server, but you want the documentation to input your production URL or your testing environment. You can add a processor that replaces all of the local hosts with that address that you want it to actually say. So that's one example. I also did one for generating kind of the generic error response. So you can hook this in and use whatever testing framework you're already using to assert things about the response. But then you also can hook into the same, so you don't have to like run the test twice. You can hook into the same thing and read what's coming off of this response in this case, that it's just the Spring Boot generic timestamp path message. You get type information. With JSON, that's not that interesting. You just have a few different types, but for XML, you can see where that might be kind of useful. And then you can add a description as far as what each of these fields does that will end up getting translated into the template that's used in the ASCII doc. So I took each of the three endpoints and wrote some basic tests for them. Wrote it in a way that's stepwise. So what this means is that it's first going to run a test that creates a document, then run the test for listing them, knowing that one already exists, and then to grab a particular one by the ID that's shared between the two tests. I've already started to notice, right, that between these three tests we'd have to rewrite each of those fields. So you can reuse the snippets, the snippet descriptors, and let's not do that. IntelliJ is freaking out a little bit. So describe just the idea and the message there. And okay, so the thing that's kind of a gotcha if you've used Spring REST docs before or haven't is this notation of the square brackets, which is just that something is embedded within a list. So hopefully that will not trip you up. But if it does, it's all in the documentation again, which is great. So we have the three tests. Let's actually run this and show you what happens if something updates. So for example, when I switch from Hibernate to Mongo, Mongo uses strings for its IDs instead of numbers. And let's do this one to a number. So it used to be a number, and now it should be a string, so this should fail. And run this. I bet this is actually... Right, it's kind of misformatted with the huge blow up in IntelliJ. But the important part is here. So it actually tells you that the field types don't match. So it's pretty useful, right? That you don't have to go and try and debug and find some stack trace. You get a number or a string, and that's pretty nice. Similarly, if you change the name from message to say name or something, it will tell you that the field that's there, message, doesn't exist, and the other one is missing from the actual, like what actually happened. Test, run with errors. Okay. I should switch this back before I try to run it again, or it's going to fail. So once you have an API, some tests, you have a document, you want to hook it all together, right? So there are two ways that you can hook things in with the ASCII doc plugin, and the first one is using this generic include. So this is just a construct of ASCII doctor, and it takes the snippets directory that we defined in the build.gradle file and goes to the error example, which is what I defined to be the output directory of that particular specification. If you're using and one advantage of using JUnit, so you can use the test name from JUnit as this output directory instead of having to specify one. Because if you're using the Spock string test names, then that doesn't convert to a nice directory structure. But then within that directory, in this case, we want the response fields, and you can add some different configuration if you need to there. But the other part here, and so this is Spring Ratoack specific, there's a macro on top of just the regular ASCII Doctor Gradle plugin that uses a template as that's part of the Spring Ratoack project, and will include information about this curl request, HTTP request, and the response. And so that's this operation here. That's not part of ASCII Doctor. That's part of the Spring Ratoack edition. Okay. So if we go back to Chrome, we can actually look at, so this was the document that I generated earlier. So the include statement includes this table with all of the information as a path, a type, and a description. The operation got expanded out into this curl request, the HTTP request, and an example response. If we, there are lots of other options here as far as output formats. I just chose these three. And then, I ran this way too many times without clearing the database. The other thing that I tend to do when I create documents like this is that I can override the templates. So in particular, when you're doing request fields, you may want to specify whether something is optional or not, or if it has constraints, for instance. And the default, as I showed above, was only path, type, and description. But I can add an additional field and override the template there so that it'll tell you kind of what's required and what's not. It might be useful information for your end users as far as like what fields are there.
Verify, actually, like, because you said you override the default, but is it like...
Yeah, so it reads that.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Say, from the text, it seems that it's not optional, and you override that decision saying that it's actually optional.
Okay, so there's an optional so optional is a special one, and you'll have to be careful about the constraints that way. Optional is a special field that it'll assert is true or false. There are a few bugs related to that on the issue tracker, and it doesn't catch everything, so be careful. But if you specify that something should be optional, then it won't check if it's there or not. But if you don't add this optional and it's missing, then the test will fail, if that makes sense. So it can read this from, so this is my example template. So the one that I didn't create just includes path, type, and description, and then you can add any number of other fields that you want to. This looks awful. Yeah, the IntelliJ to ASCII Doc plugin does not like to read these template files very well. Okay, that optional. Okay, so we have a doc, we have tests, we have everything generated. The next thing to do is to actually publish these. So there are different options for where you can actually send these. So you can include it as part of your running application, in which case you just send it to a static assets directory, or you can publish to GitHub pages. So in this example project, I have a publish to Gradle file that publishes to the GH pages branch and does a commit, and it looks in particular for the files that are generated or sent to that folder. So I was going to show how that works, but I don't have internet on my computer, so you won't be able to see that it's been updated. But I promise. Or anyone can check on their phone. So if I say, hi, WJUG here, this is a change to this, and if I go to publish it. Actually, I wonder if, I don't think it'll even push. Didn't think about that part. But it'll generate a new documentation, and, oh, I didn't remember to revert my test back to what it used to be. Yeah. See, it won't even let me push the change. Right, this is why this is blue. So if I revert this and try to run this again, yeah. So we see that so Gradle's really nice about caching a lot of this stuff, but it will rerun the tests again. And once the tests have passed, then it will run the ASCII Doctor plugin to take the snippets, add them to your existing documentation, merge that into your HTML file, and then publish those to Git, which of course failed because I don't have the internet connection. But if it did, you could see on that website right now, at the top, it should say hi in the thing that I had changed. So that is, you can add it to your application, you can push it to GitHub pages, or you can take the Postman integration that was done and do that. So I moved this collection here, and of course it's not pretty printed, but if I go back, oh, come on. And so what I had done is I imported that JSON file into Postman, and it took those examples from the doc, and now I can try it, so to speak. So I can create. Actually, I would need to start up the application using boot run. But if I take a message, and so this was actually the example that came from my tests, and it pre-filled all this data here. The one thing that I had to do was mess with Postman a little bit, so you can have them run sequentially, pull data from one, and actually use this runner feature, which I think almost everyone had seen Postman before, so they probably know how most of this works, right? Okay. Anyway, yeah, so it can take those snippets and create examples that you can run directly this way. And that should conclude the Spring REST docs example. Went through how to do snippets, publishing strategies. So these are all, everything I went through in the code demo is also on slides, should anything have possibly failed. Or just to take home. So let's start back here. So if you are in a very particular use case, you can actually make a lot of this shorter. So a lot of the things that I had done in the config as far as setting up the tests get even easier if, come on. You are using mock MVC and Spring, setting it up through auto configure. And so all of these things that I commented out are no longer necessary if you're using kind of the defaults there. And you can specify all of these things in the annotation instead of setting all of it up manually. Of course, it only works in that one case. It might be different now with I haven't looked at the Spring 2 documentation for this, but it was included, I want to say Spring Boot 1.2 or 1.3, that Spring REST docs was included as a dependency, so you can just run that.
From what I remember, you don't have to provide output directory, because it's going to know that it's a Gradle one to put it to build.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah, that was an interesting thing that you always had to do the build because it couldn't determine the difference between the Gradle and. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So it's fixed. No. So this is only the use case where it's mock MVC, because it needs to hook in with the defaults for setting up the application context, which is the grayed out portion at the bottom. Unless that has changed since the last time I looked at it. but I didn't see one for rest assured. Although it's not that many lines of code it's removing, so comparatively. But if you do want to use rest assured, you can do that, and it will enable you to use Ratpack and Grails and lots of other frameworks. Right, so we switch out the testing framework for rest assured, and it's an example repository on GitHub. If you want to look at the specifics of the line by line, the link to the pull request is there. But the biggest portion of it is this. So the formatting is a little bit wonky. This would be one long file in the code. And so this is an example of a Ratpack route handling. And so it's done by DSL and by pattern matching, and it's not like a specific annotation on a particular controller. And so a route can be mapped to different things depending on what's going in. And the major thing that's happening here is that if anything under the path, so slash, and then the ISBN is a variable here. So if you're doing /API/books and then you provide that variable, it will get that book with that particular ISBN number. But if you aren't within that path, if you're just getting all the books, or you can post to create a new one. But you can hopefully kind of see that it would be really difficult to add an annotation on top of this to kind of tell where to generate a Swagger spec or anything like that. So a lot of times if you're using Ratpack and Swagger, you have to use that custom thing and define your own specification. And then I have no idea how you would assert that everything is correct unless you did a test for it. So most of the rest of the test looks the same, except that rest assured uses filters instead of the consume with. And the rest assured, I think I mentioned this, so rest assured actually runs against the entire application. So in Ratpack, we have the entire application under test. So it has to start up the application and then run a test against it. But that can be very powerful in testing like everything that happens. Or you can even use this then to go further and document an API you don't have control over. So I wrote a blog post a long time ago now about how to do this. The root of it is just to set the base URI to a particular HTTP endpoint. And so maybe this is like kind of weird. Why would I want to do this? So if you're in a large organization and you don't have control over another team, or if we're talking about running like in very siloed situations, you could have a QA or a test environment that runs it separately in a Selenium type setup. Yeah, and especially so if the original API is written in something that isn't Spring, you can still use Spring REST docs for the tests. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. So this was all several years ago now. I've been using Spring REST docs for a long time. When I left the organization, I was still in contact with some of the people that we set up this project with. They've now all left. But as for at least a year, they were all happy with using Spring REST docs. And a lot of the problems that we were facing with all the documentation looking different, everyone had a plan for all the teams, everything was great, right? Right. But this is just the simple case, right? We had to do a lot of other things to add our security, to document constraints. I haven't even started to talk about hypermedia, but these are all, luckily, topics that are covered by the wonderful docs that Andy has written. And there is a growing list of third-party extensions. So the WireMock one, which is particularly used in the Spring Cloud contract stuff. If you're using Jersey, so that was something that I haven't played around with yet, but there is a tool to use that, or an extension to use that instead. There's kind of an interesting library that I'm not sure how I feel about yet called Ratoack. So Ratoack will even take out some of the part that I was writing with the manual tests and try to kind of generate those. And if you use, if you use RAML, there's a converter for that too. It works very similarly to the Postman one I showed, but just generates a RAML specification from all of the example snippets. Yep. So, oh, come on. Okay. So, in conclusion, it was a really tough project to try and get everyone on the same page, get a consistent look and feel. There were so many different tools to choose from, but I think that we made the right choice by choosing Spring Ratoack based on our use cases, and it helped me become a better engineer. I wrote a lot more tests, the documentation was a lot better, and our source code was a lot cleaner and easier to read. And of course, I still don't like writing documentation, but at least it's a lot easier to do now. If you want to get started, get help, there is a Gitter for the Spring Ratoack community. It's part of the Spring Projects team. And if you're a Groovy person, I have to, of course, plug that you should join the Groovy community Slack channel that I run. Okay. I think I ran a bit faster than I was anticipating, but what questions do you have that haven't been asked already?
Documentation generated by this tool to Git repositories or to any kind of wikis or web pages?
It's a good question. So the question was whether it's limited to publishing just to the GitHub pages, or, yeah.
I need to publish generated documentation to company wiki.
To a company wiki, yeah.
Is it possible with Spring Ratoack?
So Spring Ratoack kind of ends at the point where you create the HTML file. The rest of it I did was all just Gradle functions and Gradle plugins. By publishing it to GitHub, that's all a Gradle plugin. So I don't see any reason why you couldn't publish it to any other location. Once your HTML file is generated in your build file or your source file or wherever you want to send it to in that outputs directory, you can push it. There's lots of different ways to do that depending on your system.
Spring Ratoack?
Yeah.
Or is it embedded in Spring Ratoack?
No, it's all Gradle and ASCII Doctor stuff. And actually, so I've been promoting the HTML part pretty thoroughly, but ASCII Doc is nice as a format because you can convert it to lots of other formats. So you write one document, and you could also export it as PDF or as a book. I know that the Ratoack book was written using ASCII Doc and ASCII Doctor. And then you have any number of output formats. This and you can even embed it in the HTML. So what I've seen someone do for an open source project is that they embed the PDF link in the HTML. So you have a source, and then you can just download the PDF too, and it's all generated from the same central doc. Yep. And publish. Yeah. It's all about the build process there, and not just about Spring Ratoack. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you could do that with Swagger too, I guess, with the output HTML. Okay.
The wiki, what I We can generate and publish API documentation.
Actually, so one thing at the talk at Great Conf. Wait, are you looking? Yeah.
Plugins to convert ASCII Doctor to Confluence.
That was what I was going to mention. So, yeah, even the Confluence. So Confluence uses from what I heard, and I haven't personally used this. We're going to try to do this because we have Confluence too. That Confluence uses a slightly different variant of Markdown, and the speaker at Great Conf was able to use an API to take not Spring REST docs, but just general an ASCII doc file and send it to Confluence and actually get Confluence to recognize the diffs and do some really powerful things that I thought just looked amazing.
I think it's called Confluence Publisher.
Confluence Publisher, okay.
Then again, you can just you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
HTML or
Yeah.
use Jenkins to publish it wherever you want. So
Also true, yes. Yeah, whatever your build pipeline is.
Maybe not really a question, but
Okay.
more of a note. I personally like ASCII Doctor a lot.
Yeah.
I use it on a lot of open source projects. And the nice thing about what you can, because you talked only about testing RESTful APIs.
Yep.
But you can also use ASCII Doctor to, so if you're documenting a framework and you want to have an executable snippets of code inside of your documentation, which are actually executed as part of your build process. ASCII Doctor is a really good tool for that as well, because you can just take your tests and put in some tags inside of your test file, and then take it out of your tests and put it into your ASCII Doctor documentation.
Okay. Yeah.
ASCII Doctor is a really, really cool, good tool for executable documentation.
Yeah. So to repeat that, the comment was that ASCII doc is useful for a lot more than just this, of course. Like, this is just about how to do like API documentation, but a lot of open source projects use ASCII doc and ASCII Doctor to publish their documentation for the project itself. So you can embed, instead of just doing the API tests, you can generate any kind of sub or template using the tests of your framework or even the code itself, and publish that with each release of your framework or your project. Yeah, I mean, I was doing this so I created another presentation that uses ASCII doc and Reveal.js. And so I can pull in particular code snippets that I know are correct, so I don't have to keep using these Keynote slides and making copy-paste errors. And so if you actually write a project, you can pull that in directly and make your slides that way, if you're a presenter.
Can you use this tool to also create reports for running tests?
Okay, so the question was, can you use this for test report generation? I imagine so. Yeah, but there are, yeah.
A library that will generate very nice reports of it.
which also generate JUnit reports, which can be done.
Yeah. Yeah. There are lots of other. Maybe I mean, I don't think that they use, because I've seen the one for at least for the CodeNarc reports, and they build up the HTML themselves. They don't use ASCII doc, but I don't know what Spock does under the hood. Yeah. Spock reports. Sorry. Yes.
Build framework to run, or whatever runs the JUnit tests and
Reads the output. And yeah.
well, right, so Spock by itself, I don't think it has a JUnit runner, I think.
Yeah.
It generates your test reports. So.
And then those get converted using whatever testing or report framework you're using. But if you want to write your own, I'm sure you can. If you're too scared to ask now, I will stay around for a bit. Not too long, though. I do have to take the train in the morning, so. Okay. I guess so.